However, Kansas is a little bit different. Kansas has a weird law. In fact, they still have it today. There was a book written a few years ago called The Trouble with Kansas. Kansas allows you to move to Kansas, register to vote, and vote all on the same day. Most states you've got to register to vote 90 days before the election, and you've got to prove citizenship. All you had to do in Kansas, still, in fact, all you have to do in Kansas is show up, swear an affidavit that you're a resident, register to vote, and they'll give you a temporary voter certificate, and you can go vote. Well, that's kind of cool, except the battle for control of the Senate and the House all comes down to what will Kansas do? So people, true believers on both sides, all rush into Kansas. You have militant abolitionists that want to outlaw slavery, rush into Kansas. And you have militant pro-slave people all rush in at one time. And they register to vote and vote. The population of Kansas more than doubled overnight. We had a bunch of people voting in their election that really didn't live in Kansas. And the election was super, super close. In fact, it was so close that both sides claimed victory. It was close enough that the margin of error came into play. So we end up with Kansas having two governments. You had a slave government established in Shawnee and a free soil government established in Topeka. They each wrote their own constitution. They each had their own governor. They each had their own Congress. And they each claimed to be the only legitimate government of the whole state. You see the problem here? No matter what you do, you're probably in violation of the law because there's two sets of laws. Okay? And the people of Kansas really didn't know what to do. It got seriously out of control. These militant, particularly the militant slave owners, ended up rushing in, and we call it Bloody Kansas because there was a civil war in the streets. Things happened like the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre. This guy, John Brown, that's him in the middle there. John Brown was a preacher and an abolitionist, and he believed that God was telling him that his job was to free the slaves in Kansas. So he rushed in with his church, and it was a kind of crazy cult-like church that he came in with. And while he had good goals, his goals were abolitionism, in slavery. In 1856, he, along with his children, his sons, and several church members, in the darkness of night, snuck into a slave-owning community in Pottawatomie Creek, and with swords slaughtered everybody. Well, you're a little crazy if you're doing that, okay? The result of this was John Brown is seen as a hero in the North and a villain in the South. This is not the last time we're going to see John Brown. He's going to escape from Kansas, and we're going to run into him again at Harper's Ferry. But he's kind of known as this firebrand abolitionist. Ultimately, the Lee-Compton Constitution of 1857 emerges, and Kansas becomes a slave state. And my computer is locked up. I'm going to skip the caning in Congress. It's a good story, but we don't really have time for it. So we're going to get to our next two-party system. This is the third two-party system. The first was the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The second was the Democratic Republican, or Democrats and Whigs. Well, now we're at the Democrats and Republicans. The Republican Party is going to be born in 1854 in a place called Ripon, Wisconsin. And it's going to replace the collapsed Whig Party. Remember, the Whig Party collapsed because it couldn't decide, it couldn't make its mind up on what it believed about the single most important issue of the day, slavery. It divided into cotton Whigs and conscience Whigs. Cotton Whigs were pro-slavery, conscience Whigs were anti-slavery. So when it collapsed, the Republican Party kind of replaces it. And it collects all these anti-slavery people. Northern Whigs, Northern Democrats, Free Soilers, members of the Know Nothing Party, that was the American Party, and basically anybody that was against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This became the new anti-slavery umbrella party. And it was big. Almost immediately, it was big. It wasn't like these parties that slowly emerged, like, today's Libertarian Party has been kicking around since 1972. It's kind of emerges in 1854, and by 1856 it has a presidential candidate. I mean, it's going to be something serious that happens fast. 1856, the Democrats nominate this guy, James Buchanan, in the top left. The Republicans nominate John C. Fremont down here at the bottom left. And the Know Nothings nominate former failed President Millard Fillmore as their party standard. Millard Fillmore would like to return to the presidency. Remember, he's the one that was vice president and was raised to the office when Zachary Taylor died, finished Taylor's presidency. It was a strange year. The Republicans were a new party, and while they were growing dramatically, they were still a new party. The American Party was kind of a fringe party, and the Democrats were the old tried and true. Plus, out of these three, James Buchanan and Millard Fillmore were the big stars. Fremont was an explorer. They called him the Pathfinder. He'd explored the Southwest. Buchanan is a little bit lucky here. He had spent most of the 1840s and 50s as an ambassador, mostly in Russia, but in some other places too. And that's going to be important because while everybody else was out putting out their opinion about slavery, he got to stay out of that argument because he was in another country. So when he comes back, he doesn't have a record of saying stupid things for the last 15 years. Okay? Millard Fillmore is recognized as a failed president. John C. Fremont is a screaming abolitionist in a time period when half the country wasn't. So James Buchanan gets raised to the office of the presidency. By the way, James Buchanan is a lifelong bachelor, never marries. He was engaged once when he was 19 years old, and she killed herself, committed suicide. Never got engaged or married again. There are some questions about James Buchanan. It's not really pertinent to the class, but it's at least interesting that we may have already had our first gay president. Buchanan and another gentleman lived together for about 30 years. And years later, after Buchanan died, his family released his papers. And there were what really appears to be love letters between him and this other gentleman. It's all speculation, but it kind of appears that way. And there were people that thought of him that way at the time period, just because he'd been. So James Buchanan is the new president. He wins 45% of the popular vote with a pretty overwhelming victory in the Electoral College. Buchanan wins all of these blue states. You see Fremont gets the green, and Millard Fillmore doesn't get much. Okay? I'm Amongst all this, we're going to have another important Supreme Court case. You need to know this case. This is one of the few cases from this time period that could be on your STAR test in 11th grade. So it's pretty important. This gentleman on the left is Dred Scott. He was a slave. The gentleman on the right is Chief Justice Roger Taney. Roger Taney has been kicking around since the 1830s on the Supreme Court. He was a Jackson appointee, so he's been around a while. And Dred Scott's owner took him and moved to a free state, a state where slavery was illegal. So Dred Scott, being the intelligent man that he was, he sued. And here was his logic. My owner took me to a free state. This is a state where slavery is illegal. Therefore, I am no longer a slave. I am a free man. It's a good argument. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court disagreed. Roger Taney himself wrote the decision in what I think is probably the worst decision in Supreme Court history. Roger Taney said that slaves are not citizens, first off. So since they're not citizens, they don't have the right to use the court system. So I should dismiss this case immediately just because you don't even have the right to use the court. But he goes a step further and says, what you are is property. And the Constitution guarantees the right to protection of private property. Therefore, he says, even as long as you were bought legally in a slave state, if your owner moves, the government can't then take your property away from you. You legally still own them. Wow. He's just undone completely all the compromises that stopped the Civil War. Because of this, we really don't have slave states and free states at this point. You could go buy a slave anywhere you want to. It's your property. You take it. As long as you buy your slave in a place where the slave trade is legal. This is going to be one more weight there on the back of the nation. That weight that's going to break the nation. We're going to have a civil war. Terrible decision.
So you think he should have got his freedom?
Absolutely, I think he should have got his freedom.
That's what I was thinking. It only makes sense.
It does make sense. Roger Taney was a terrible, terrible racist. Amongst all this, we're going to get to meet a new celebrity, Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln had been a one-term congressman from Illinois. We met him during the Mexican War when he introduced the Splott resolutions. But now he's running for Senate against an old rival of his, a man named Stephen Douglas. Stephen Douglas already has the Senate seat, and he's trying to keep it. Lincoln wants to take it. These two guys do not like each other. They had been lawyers together in Springfield, Illinois. They've been partners at one point. They'd even dated the same woman. Lincoln won and married her. I don't know if that's a win or not, because Mary Todd Lincoln turns out to be crazy. But Lincoln is going to challenge him. And they're going to have a series of debates in all these places across Illinois that are going to be carried in the newspapers like it's a rock and roll concert. People are going to follow him around, and two totally different styles. Stephen Douglas they called him the Little Giant. He was a little short, fat man. But he had that big, deep, booming Baptist preacher kind of voice. And when he talked in a very formal way. Was a great speaker. Very, very formalized. Very much like a preacher. And then you had Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was this tall, rail-skinny guy with a real high-pitched voice. And he talked the language of the common man. People liked it. the comparison was there. You had one that seemed to be a man of the people, and one that seemed to kind of be a man of the establishment. Okay? This is where Lincoln gives his famous speech where he quotes the Bible. He says, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." What he means here is the United States will not continue to exist half slave and half free. At this point, Lincoln is not saying slavery should be illegal. At this point, Lincoln is saying, I would accept it either way. Either slavery needs to be illegal everywhere, or slavery needs to be allowed everywhere. Okay? He has not yet made that full abolitionist step. But he's moving forward. By the way, Lincoln lost this election for the Senate. But that's okay, because that's 1858.
He comes back.
And 2 years later, he's going to run and win the presidency. So
Against the same guy.
against the same guy, yes. Let's talk a little bit more about this guy, John Brown. Remember, John Brown was that preacher that slaughtered a whole village at Pottawatomie Creek with swords. Well, now he's having visions. Remember, I told you he's a little crazy. Well, he has this vision, and in his vision, he believes God is telling him that he is going to lead a race war, and the blacks of America will all rise up, gather up slaves, and he will lead them in overthrowing the government and establishing a free nation. But what he needs are guns. So again, he and his cult, including his kids, go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Today it would be West Virginia, but there wasn't a place called West Virginia yet, okay? Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where there is a federal arsenal. It's the place where the Army keeps their guns.
Oh, God.
And he captures it.
Oh, he does?
He captures the arsenal with the intention of arming the blacks. And he waits for the blacks to march in and gather the guns and lead an army. But none of them show. Turns out that whatever vision contacted him didn't contact the blacks in the community and tell them to do it. Instead, he's captured inside the arsenal. Robert E. Lee, along with a group of U.S. Marines, surround the arsenal. There's a gunfire. Several people are killed. John Brown is captured. He's put on trial. He's found guilty of treason, and he's hanged. This is probably the biggest mistake we ever made, because by hanging him, they turned him into a martyr. You know what a martyr is?
Example?
A martyr, yeah, kind of. A martyr is somebody that dies for a cause. Think of Jesus or Gandhi or Crispus Attucks, maybe to an extent. Martin Luther King. Okay. Suddenly they become a hero because they died. They become more heroic than if they would have lived. Well, that's what happens to John Brown. Had John Brown continued to live and spout his crazy ideas that people are, he's getting these visions, people might have realized that John Brown was a nut. But instead, he's killed, and all people see is this man just wanted to free the blacks, and the government killed him. It turned him into a hero. Okay? Now, John Brown, I will tell you, John Brown to this day is a controversial figure because his goals were good. That does not make him any less crazy, in my opinion. Okay? You can have good goals and still be crazy. The big problem with slavery is the development of King Cotton. This is the nickname that was given to cotton because cotton was by far the most important thing in our economy. But it wasn't always. In fact, in the 1820s and 30s, it looked like slavery was going to die out because slavery was not profitable. That's hard to imagine. Why would slavery not be profitable? Well, it wasn't profitable because the the hard part of cotton is not picking the cotton, although that's miserable. The hard part about cotton is taking the seeds out of it. And it just wasn't profitable. Slaves could not pick the seed out fast enough to make it profitable to own a slave to do this. And then Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Now, Eli Whitney didn't really invent the cotton gin. There was a cotton gin already, but he invented a version of the cotton gin that worked on American cotton. American cotton has a real slick seed, and the other machine didn't work. He invented one that would work. And this is a cutaway version of what a cotton gin looks like if you're at all curious. You put the raw cotton in, you spin this wheel, and these fingers over here pull the seeds out. So suddenly, you could process cotton 10, 15 times faster than you could before. And slavery became profitable again, okay? And that's going to be what fuels the growth of slavery and the Civil War. Interestingly enough, we always think of cotton as a southern commodity because we grew the cotton down here in the South. But people forget that the North was making a fortune of it. They were the ones shipping it. It was shipped on northern ships. They were getting rich off of slavery too, okay? The South was producing more than half of the world's cotton. And the South believed that cotton was so important that they could force the world to do what they want to by either supplying or withholding cotton. That was their mistake. When the Civil War broke out, they thought they could say, well, we just won't give you any cotton, and everybody would bend to their knees, okay? Didn't work out that way. I'll show you why in a minute. We're going to skip that. So, why is the slave system a problem? There's a lot of reasons. First off, it's monopolistic. You have a small group of planters that control the entire class. So in the South, you kind of had feudalism happening. If you remember what feudalism is from world history, it was like kings and princes. Well, they had something similar to that, where you had these large landowners, and then you had tenant farmers that would live on the land, and you would have slaves that worked it. Contrary to what Gone with the Wind tells us, everybody in the South didn't own slaves. The vast majority of Southerners couldn't afford a slave. A slave was about as much, if you adjusted the dollars, it would be like buying a car today, okay? If you did own a slave, you probably owned no more than two. Most would just own one. And most people worked alongside their slaves. Because while slavery was valuable, it's still a big gamble, okay? Think about it. You might spend $50,000 on a new car, but your new car is not going to run away without you. A slave might. It's a big gamble. What if your slave gets hurt or sick? Or what if he's just stupid and incapable of doing the work? What if he runs away?
That's why I was really confused, because like they say they used to beat their slaves,
Yeah.
but if they're hurt, they can't work. Like,
Yeah,
so-
it was pretty rare to just beat them to where they were hurt badly. You don't do that to your workers. The other problem with the slave system is that cotton was so profitable that we became a one-crop economy. It's called a plantation economy. We quit growing everything else. And that's fine as long as people will buy them. But what happens when the European market opens up their own markets? And that's going to be what happens in the 1850s and 60s, is suddenly you had Egyptian cotton starting to appear. And England's like, I can just buy my cotton over there. I don't have to go buy it from you. It's closer to go here. And when the European market stops wanting to buy our cotton so at high cost, it's going to drive the prices down. That's going to cause problems. Other reasons why the Southern economy did poorly is because the South largely closed off to immigrants. We didn't want immigrants here. The North did. And the immigrants that came to the North brought with them new industrial ideas. We just didn't have the industry in the South, okay? That one crop economy is really going to hurt us. I'm skipping some of this, I know I am. We don't have to write this down, but I want to talk about it for a second. We always forget about one group of blacks. We always think that all the blacks were slaves. But there was actually a fairly large group of free blacks. In the North, they were usually the descendants of people that were freed after the American Revolution. Remember, George Washington had made a promise that if you served in the Continental Army for 3 years, I believe, that you'd get your freedom. Well, some of them got it. Some did, but some didn't. In the South, the free blacks were usually mulattoes, which is a terrible term, but it's the old term for somebody that is half black, half white. Why would they be free? A lot of times they're the master's kids, okay? And it's hard to enslave your own children. They wouldn't claim them, but they would free them and let them go as free blacks. Many of these free blacks owned property. A few even owned slaves. In fact, right here in Texas, one of the biggest slave owners in the state was a free black man. I also don't want you thinking that racism was somehow worse in the South than it was in the North. It was not. They were just as racist in the North as they were in the South. They just didn't have slavery because it wasn't profitable. They hated the free blacks up north because they saw them as competition, particularly the Irish. They were taking the same jobs. All right? All right. Got to move on. So what?
Read this one.
Get the first one and the last one anyway. So even though the importation of slaves was outlawed way back in 1808, that just means that you couldn't bring more slaves in from Africa. You had to raise them. Smuggling would continue all the way up through 1860. About 4 million African slaves were smuggled into the country. So much so that in the Deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, blacks are the majority. There are more blacks than there are whites at this point. What are you going to do to get to get those slaves? Well, you've got to encourage women to have more children. To me, this is one of the saddest things we ever did as a nation. Sometimes slave owners would promise women their freedom if they had 10 children. Almost never carried through. Think about what a mother has to be doing. They have to agree to give birth to 10 children that will be slaves in order to have their own freedom. Slave auctions are brutal things to see. If you ever been to a livestock auction, that's what they look like. They would bring the slaves out frequently in nothing but a breech clout, or sometimes wearing nothing at all because they want to show the muscles off, you know. They would pull their lips back so you could see their gums to see if they were healthy. They would bend them around. They would refer to them as good breeders. I mean, it was a terrible, terrible thing to see. In fact, one of our greatest authors, Harriet Beecher Stowe, came across one of these slave auctions, and it changed her mind about slavery. She was a pro-slavery person. Even though her family was abolitionists, she was a pro-slavery person until she saw this auction. And she goes on and writes the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin is a novel. It's an anti-slavery novel. I highly suggest you read it at some point in your life. Really a good book. Talks about the evils of slavery. It's the story of a slave woman who's escaping, and Uncle Tom, her overseer, turns her in. The master is chasing her down with dogs, and she's running across. It ends with her running across the Ohio River with dogs attacking her, and she drops her baby in the frozen river. It's really disturbing. Okay. But the book did a great job of showing the evils of slavery. By the way, so much so that when Abraham Lincoln in 1863, when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So you're the little lady that started this great big war," talking about the Civil War. He believed she changed enough people's minds to go to war over. Super good book. So while these slaves were being punished, they were still pretty ingenious in a lot of ways. While they were illiterate, they couldn't read and write frequently because it was a crime to teach them to read and write in most states, they still found ways to rebel without being having too much of a risk to it. Like tool breaking. If you break the mill, it becomes hard to process the corn. If you break the cotton gin, it becomes hard to process the cotton. They would slow down working. They would call a cadence. If you've never been in a marching band or something like that, you don't understand cadence. But I'm an old Marine, and I'll tell you, they can control how fast you move by how they sing to you. If you're marching and you hear left, 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 right, left, you're going slow. And then all of a sudden you hear low, right, lay-o, lefty, right, lay-o. You're running now, okay? Well, the same thing happened in the fields. They would sing songs to what they called African hollers. They would sing these songs to try and encourage people to work. And if the master was treating people well, they would sing a faster song and get things done. But if the master was abusing him, that song would slow down, and they start singing gospel songs. And the amount of cotton that you picked was slowed down. Sometimes house servants would even poison food. Not enough to kill you, but enough to make you sick. Because if the lady of the house was sick and in bed, guess who ran things? The head slave. And that made things a whole lot easier. We have lots of examples of this kind of stuff, okay?
Sounds like every day. I mean, if you did kill them, they didn't have anything back then to really find out if you were poisoned.
No, but they didn't have a burden of evidence. And if they just assumed you had done it, you'd be dead. So,
yeah.
All right, so 1860. This is the Republican Party platform. It has a little bit of something for everybody. It calls for the non-extension of slavery into that territory that we captured from Mexico. Okay? That's good because it's going to please the free soilers. Calls for a high protective tariff. Remember, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. This makes the northern industrialists happy because it makes foreign goods more expensive. So maybe you'll buy more of their goods. The third one, no abridgment of rights for immigrants. Basically what this means is immigrants are going to have all the rights that everybody else is. The know-nothings aren't going to like this. The know-nothings were a nativist party. They wanted to build a railroad all the way to the Pacific. They wanted the government to help finance a transcontinental Pacific railroad. The Northwest loved this. They wanted to build internal improvements like roads, bridges, tunnels, canals.
Like John Quincy Adams.
Like John Quincy Adams did. Very good. That's going to make the West mad. I'm sorry, going to make the West happy. It's going to make the Northeast mad. And finally, for farmers, there's going to be free homesteads. All this government land, if you came and moved on it and paid the taxes on it, you could have the land for free. That was to encourage you to move out west. Farmers liked it. So they had a little something for everybody.
So that's going to be a good thing.
That's a good thing. This is a winning platform. Y'all got it? Okay.
They probably don't. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Oh, there's a lot of people.
All right, so 1860 comes along, and there are 4 really strong candidates. This was supposed to be a Democrat year. The Democrats were supposed to win this easily. Abraham Lincoln is running as a Republican. Now remember, this party's only 6 years old. It's a brand new party still. And Lincoln's an old Whig. Stephen Douglas gets the Democrat nod. That's him at the top right. John Bell, bottom left, gets the American Party. And John C. Breckinridge at the bottom right gets a break off of the Democrats called the Southern Democrats. What happens here is the Democrat Party does the same thing the Whigs had done previously. They break up over the issue of slavery. And you end up with Douglas being a popular sovereignty kind of guy, and Breckinridge being a pro-slavery candidate. The result was that even though there were more Democrats in the country than there were anyone else, because there were 2 Democrats running for president, the Democrats didn't really know who to vote for. And the nation started ripping itself apart. This is an editorial cartoon to kind of give you a feel for it. You can see that each candidate was taking apart of the nation. You had regional candidates again, each one ripping apart, okay? Ultimately, because of confusion among the Democrats, Abraham Lincoln wins the presidency. But I want you to look at this. He got 180 electoral votes, which was enough to win the presidency. But that's only 40%, 39.8% of the popular vote. That means that Lincoln is going to become president, and 60% of people voted for somebody else. Okay? It's a weird election because of where it is. Look at this. Breckinridge got 72 electoral votes, but only 18% of the popular vote. Douglas, 12 electoral, but 30% of the popular vote. It's because of the way the math worked out. Lincoln got his votes in the right places, okay? All the purple states went to Lincoln. The orange states went to Breckinridge. Green for Douglas, and John Bell went his little border states, okay? So, kind of a mess of an election. Lincoln is going to have a very hard time as president. Even before Lincoln is sworn in, he's not going to take office till January of 1861. But in December, South Carolina is going to secede. They're going to leave the Union because of the election of Lincoln. They're afraid that Lincoln is going to end slavery everywhere. And you can see the dates here. Don't worry about getting the dates. But all these blue states end up seceding before there's ever a shot, before Fort Sumter. And the purple states secede after Fort Sumter. These orange states up here are called border states. Those are states that kept slavery but stayed loyal to the Union. Okay? So they were pro-slavery Union states. You don't have to write this down, but I'll talk about it. Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1861. The Confederacy elects Jefferson Davis the president on the same day. He's sworn in. And Lincoln gives a speech where he says the Union cannot be split. There's a lot of problems. First off, what do you do about the land? The federal land. Do I get to keep the federal land, or do you have it? How about the national debt? Are you going to take your part of the debt with you too? What are you going to do? Okay? This is the big one, Fort Sumter. By the way, see that flag up there? That's the Confederate flag, not the one on top of the General Lee on Dukes of Hazzard. Okay? That's what the Confederate flag looked like. Fort Sumter, South Carolina, is an important base. Even though South Carolina had seceded, the base had stayed loyal to the United States. So there's this federal arsenal, this federal base sitting right off the coast of South Carolina. The governor of South Carolina orders them to turn it over. Lincoln refuses to give those orders. So it comes down to a standoff. And Lincoln picks a fight here. He really does. He tells the governor that he's going to send a barge over to Fort Sumter. The barge is going to carry medicine, food, and clothing. No guns, no bullets. Just medicine, food, and clothing. This puts the governor of South Carolina in a bad place. If he lets that barge go over there, he's kind of admitting that it's federal land. If he doesn't let it go over there, he's the guy that's shooting at a barge carrying food and medicine. Makes him a bad guy, right? Well, April 12, 1861, Lincoln orders it to go. It crosses, and the governor of South Carolina orders cannons to shoot at it. Fort Sumter is going to fall very quickly. It's going to become a Confederate base. And Lincoln can now say the South fired the first shots. Now, did they fire the first shots? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did Lincoln pick a fight with them? Absolutely. He knew they had to. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers. He gets over 200,000. So many people show up that he sends them away. And Lincoln issues a blockade on South Carolina. Okay? America is upset. South Carolina looks like it's making a mistake. That is an actual picture of Fort Sumter, though. Yeah. The Civil War was the first war that was actually photographed. All right, so what's the Southern response? You have Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina secede immediately. They join the Confederacy because they see what Lincoln's doing is wrong. Okay? It's naked aggression. They also moved the capital to Richmond, Virginia because of this. That always seemed weird to me. Richmond, Virginia is almost a suburb of Washington, D.C. They are very close together, okay? It's really weird that the two capitals were that close, but they were. There was a reason for it. Virginia is where Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe were from. Virginia was the traditional home of the nation, and the Confederacy wanted to have that link. I think it was a mistake. Capital should have been way down in Alabama or something where it was safe. By the way, I don't know if y'all know this or not, but the last capital of the Confederacy was Marshall, Texas.
I was about to say, you put it in Texas, ain't nothing to do.
Yeah.
That's up the road.
Yeah, just up the road, yeah. It was in a railroad terminal in Marshall. It was just like one guy with the paperwork. It was after the Confederacy had really officially surrendered.
You're good.
Okay. We're not going to do this. Need this. All right, what are the Southern advantages? First off, it only had to get a draw to win. The South was not trying to defeat the North. The South just wanted to be left alone to have their own land. Second, almost all of the officers in the Army were Southerners. So when they went to pick sides, they all picked the Confederacy. In fact, Lincoln's first choice to rule the U.S. Army was Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee considered it and then decided to join the Confederate cause instead. Third, because most of the battling will happen in the South, they're going to have a home front advantage. And that's a pretty big advantage. You know where the food is, you know where the friendly people are. It works. And finally, it believed it was fighting for the spirit of 76. It thought it was fighting for the same causes that our American Revolution was fighting for. These are big advantages. And for 2 years, almost 3 years of the war, 2.5 anyway, the South is going to win.
Until we run out of stuff.
And then we run out of crap. Yep. Yep.
And then we pretty much. How does that like
When you showed us when we succeeded, we looked pretty big.
Yeah, no, a lot of space, not a lot of people. Large land mass, small amount of people.
What does it mean by spirit of cities? Like, was it year 1876?
1776, the year of the
Like the-
Declaration.
Oh.
They got the spirit of the revolution.
Okay, that makes sense.
Here were the northern advantages. Not as many, but probably more important. They had all the industry. That means that they made the guns and the ships. They had a much larger population. That's going to be the most important thing. And finally, almost all the naval bases were in the north, so they're going to control the sea. The South's fighting spirit is going to help them for a couple of years, but then they run out of bullets. Your fighting spirit doesn't do much good when you've got to charge against an enemy with a club. Okay?
Throw your gun at him.
Yeah.
Catch.
I'm skipping some of this. I know I am, and I'm sorry. All right, so this is also the first war where we suspended a lot of liberties. This is my reason for not being a fan of Lincoln, to be honest with you. I'm very thankful for his position on slavery, but he was the first president to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Habeas corpus literally in Latin means have a body, and it's the legal belief that you cannot be locked up without a trial. There has to be evidence, and you have to have a trial. Lincoln locked people up in prison without trials because they were deemed a danger to the Union. He locked up newspaper reporters for writing bad things about the Union. Locked up people accused of being spies. That's a big problem for him. Both the United States and the Confederacy issued a draft. We call these conscription laws. For the first time, this is the very first draft in American history. You got a letter from the government saying, congratulations, you've been selected by your neighbors to serve in the armed forces. And you better search, you better show up. If you don't, you're going to jail. Both the North and the South had some exemptions to this. For instance, if you had enough money, you could pay to get out of it. You could pay somebody else to go with you, or to go for you. And that's what happened a lot. A lot of immigrants would sell themselves into service for the rich men. This is where the saying, it was a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight came from. Because the rich were in Congress declaring war, but then they were paying the poor to go actually fight the war. The South was a lot more reluctant to limit states' rights. They were later in conscripting. They had less privacy laws. They didn't lock people up without trials. And that's going to cost them. It's going to probably cost them a year of the war.
How long did the war last?
4 years,
4 years.
61 to 65.
That's long.
That's a whole term.
We used to think of that as a long war, and then we got into the one we're in now. It's been going on for 18 years.
Wait, you said, okay. So, really, the election was in 1860, but he wasn't really
Come to
in
power
on
in
this
61.
61.
Yeah.
So that's why after he got what's it called, re-elected.
Yep.
Like
64.
It didn't really count. It only counted as one term, or what? Because he got assassinated after.
Well, it's still he was elected to 2 terms, but he got assassinated very quickly after. Yeah. All right. Let's talk about the Battle of Bull Run. This is the first real big battle. July 21st, 1861. This is when we realized this war was going to be something different than we'd ever seen before. Both sides did not understand that warfare had changed. They were thinking war would be like the Mexican War, where we had very little real death on our side. But remember, the Mexican War, we had rifles and they had muskets. Well, now we both have rifles. We also have crank guns or Gatling guns, which is like an early form of a machine gun, but you turn the crank and it can go as fast as you can turn it. We had trenches. We had gas. There were things in this war that we had not seen before. And at the start of this, both sides thought this was going to be a 90-day war. The South thought they could beat the Yankees in 90 days, and the Yankees would surrender. The North thought they could come in and overpower them, and the South would surrender in 90 days.
No.
They were both wrong.
90 times like 6.
Give you an idea of how poor this was. A poor planning. They put posters up like it was a movie or something. Come see the Battle of Bull Run, today only. They scheduled a time. They said which side was going to be on which side, like it was a freaking football game or something. And people showed up with their family and picnic lunches to watch the battle.
You're kidding.
No, I'm dead serious.
This is not.
But it was so much more violent than they thought. This is an actual photograph of Manassas Creek, where the Battle of Bull Run happened, okay? This was a forest when the battle started,
Yeah.
I remember that, yeah.
okay? That's how destructive this was.
I remember that. They legit watched it like they were watching a football game.
Yeah, they were watching it.
That is not. that's
Lincoln's
not okay.
first general was George B. McClellan, Little Mac, they called him. He was a great drill master. His men were well trained. They could march with the best of them. And he was a good military leader, but he was too hesitant. He was unwilling to take risks. He was also very arrogant. Thought he was smarter than everybody, particularly Lincoln. He didn't like Lincoln at all. He had a habit of signing all of his letters from the saddle, George B. McClellan. And there's a story that was told by Lincoln. Because over and over again what would happen is McClellan would show up to fight. And if he didn't outnumber the enemy at least 4-1, he would retreat. So he just kept retreating. And Robert E. Lee just kept taking all the land. Well, he sent one letter to Lincoln and signed it that, from the saddle, George B. McClellan. And they said that Lincoln wrote back, get out of the damn saddle and fight. McClellan is ultimately going to be fired. And in 1864 is going to challenge Lincoln for the presidency. What is the Union strategy going to be? Good strategy. Blockade the South so they can't get supplies. That means put your Navy out there so they can't get supplies in from overseas, and destroy the railroads. Everywhere they go, they should free the slaves. And the thought was if we freed the slaves, they would pick up guns and they would fight on our side. Third, seize control of the Mississippi River. Super important. The fourth one is kind of dumb. Capture the capital, because apparently they thought it was a great big game of Risk. That's how wars used to happen. You would seize the capital and win. That's not how this one happens. Because we just kept moving our capital. They go, we captured Richmond. Well, our capital's not in Richmond anymore. We captured Atlanta. Well, it ain't there either. We just kept moving it, you know. And finally, the last one. This is the important one. Because remember I told you that their biggest advantage was the population? Engage the enemy at every opportunity. They have enough people that they can lose 3, 4, 5 times as many people and still win the war. And in the end, that's what happens.
This is the one that wins, right?
Yeah. In the end, the North loses more men, by far. The South outfought the North. They just couldn't outpopulate them.
They couldn't hang around as long.
So what's Lincoln going to do in order to encourage this kind of chaos? Well, on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And I know you've been told your whole life that the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. No, the 13th Amendment freed the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the rebelling states. That means all those states that joined the Confederacy, Lincoln freed them in those states. He did not free them in the border states that stayed loyal to the Union. I want you to think about that for a minute. That means Lincoln freed the slaves in the states he didn't control. How does that work?
He's a good one.
Yeah, you can't do that. So why do it? Well, it's an important document because it does outline why we fought this war. We ultimately did fight this war to free slaves. I don't care what the revisionist historians say about states' rights. The Civil War was about slavery. And huh? Well, you get this argument that the Civil War was about states' rights, not slavery. Well, yeah, but the right that the states wanted was the right to have slaves. So it was at least 90% slavery. Then we got this guy Sherman, William Tecumseh Sherman. What a great picture. Look at that guy, tough guy. Sherman is Grant's greatest officer, the best of Grant's lieutenants. Grant is the guy that ends up being the head general of the Union. Sherman is told to capture Georgia, and he is the first person to use all-out total warfare. As Sherman marched through Georgia, he burned it to the ground. He burned the largest city in the South, Atlanta. If you ever get to watch Gone with the Wind, there's a great scene at the end or in the middle of it, the burning of Atlanta. They actually, in the movie, and when they built it in 1933, they built a fake city and burned it to the ground just to film the movie. That's cool. But Sherman, he destroyed everything. He killed everything in the way. He burned all the crops. He even would take the railroads and pull the railroad ties up, heat them, and then bend them around trees. They called them Sherman's neckties, so they couldn't be put back in the railroad on the tracks. The damage that Sherman did could still be seen in Georgia 100 years later. When I lived in Georgia in '89, the old people in Georgia, when they would say Sherman, they'd spit on the street because he's still that kind of hated in that part of the country. This is just a picture of Sherman in the March to the Sea. You can see they're pulling up railroad ties. That's Atlanta burning in the background. Hey, we'll make it. Last slide. Appomattox Courthouse, the last battle of the Civil War. The writing's on the wall. The South is lost. It's 1865. It's April 9, 1865. Ulysses S. Grant gets sent papers from Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee is willing to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. It is the largest army in the South, the most successful army in the Confederacy.
Why did he surrender?
Because he couldn't win at this point. It was kill you, let your men die or surrender. So they met at this house at a place called Appomattox Courthouse. That's the name of the town, by the way. Grant meets with Lee. Lee signs the surrender paperwork. And to me, this is Grant at his best. Grant could have treated the South like a defeated nation. But instead, in the treaty ending it, he agrees to let all the soldiers, as soon as they swear an oath of allegiance, promise never to raise guns against the U.S. again, they get to take a rifle, enough ammunition to protect themselves, enough food to get home, and a horse. And they're released and allowed to go home. They're not thrown in prison. And they're forgiven for any war crime they may have committed. Because Grant says, we don't cheer the misfortune of our brothers. This should be about healing the nation, not about punishing somebody. Yeah. And while the war is not officially over, all the armies are done. This is the last surrender of the war. So we usually recognize Appomattox Courthouse as the end of it. That's April 9, 1865. Lincoln is hardly going to get to enjoy it. 6 days later, Abraham Lincoln is going to be assassinated at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. And that will actually be the first lecture of next semester. So we will pick up here when we get back after Christmas. Do not forget that you need to get your test into me.